Have you ever watched two people dig their own graves while thinking they were building a throne? Picture a freezing courtroom where a corrupt judge and my greedy sister in law smirk. 100% certain they have stripped my honor. They ordered me to remove my Navy Cross. They had no idea that metal was the pin to a live grenade destined to destroy their filthy careers. Listen closely. You should never corner a quiet veteran. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Maya Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating, which means we will be forced to stop uploading new videos here in the near future and transition our operations over to Patreon. If you enjoy today's story, please support us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon community to listen to even better, longer, and more detailed exclusive true stories featuring multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can join right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us begin today's story about a woman named Chloe Ryan. The sharp strike of the wooden gavel echoed like a gunshot against the heavy oak-paneled walls of the Coastal County Courthouse in the sleepy town of Blackwood. I stood perfectly straight behind the defendant's table, my chin raised, my shoulders squared. I am 38 years old, and my dark navy blue dress uniform was immaculate. Every single crease ironed sharp enough to cut glass, pinned securely over my heart, gleaming intensely under the harsh fluorescent overhead lights of the courtroom, was my Navy Cross. The heavy bronze metal carried the crushing weight of a raging storm, a brutal rescue operation, and the blood of the people I had pulled from the unforgiving jaws of the ocean. It was never meant to be a decorative accessory. It was a solemn testament to survival. Sitting high above everyone else on his elevated wooden bench was Judge Arthur Vance. He was an infamous figure in our county, a man heavily intoxicated by his own perceived authority and notorious for his deep, murky, interwoven relationships with the local elite. He looked down at me through his reading glasses, as if I were a piece of filthy mud that had somehow tracked its way into his pristine, controlled domain. He raised his heavy gavel and slammed it down a second time, demanding absolute submission. "Take that toy off right now. This is not a military theater," Judge Vance ordered. His voice echoed through the large room, dripping with absolute contempt, condescension, and a sickening level of arrogance. I slowly shifted my gaze to the plaintiff's table across the center aisle. Sitting there was Vanessa, my incredibly stylish and deeply shallow sister-in-law. She was dressed in a pristine white designer suit that easily cost more than a standard monthly mortgage payment, dripping in expensive jewelry bought with money she had never earned herself. A smug, mocking half-smile played on her glossed lips. She leaned over gracefully, covering her mouth with a perfectly manicured hand to whisper something amusing into her expensive corporate lawyer's ear. I could read the overwhelming triumph radiating from her posture. She was entirely convinced that this orchestrated public humiliation would be the final killing blow. She thought that stripping me of my honor in front of a gallery full of local spectators would finally shatter my willpower and force me to hand over the family legacy my father had bled to build. She was entirely wrong. I did not flinch. I did not argue. I did not show a single ounce of weakness. I was trained by the most ruthless instructors in the world to keep my heart rate at a perfectly steady 60 beats per minute. Even when enemy bullets were tearing through the air and shattering concrete mere inches from my head, the petty tyranny of a corrupt small-town judge was absolutely nothing compared to the fury of a black ocean in the dead of winter. Instead of reacting with the frantic anger or desperate tears they fully expected, I offered them absolute, terrifying silence. The air in the courtroom rapidly grew thick and suffocating. The low, gossiping murmurs from the gallery died instantly. People shifted uncomfortably in their wooden pews, clearly feeling the sudden, crushing atmospheric pressure of the room drop, moving with slow, deliberate, and highly calculated precision. I reached my right hand up to my chest. I unclasped the backing pin of the Navy Cross. I made sure my hands did not shake even a fraction of a millimeter. I carefully lowered the heavy bronze cross from my uniform and placed it gently into a small velvet-lined wooden box I had brought with me, snapping the lid shut with a sharp click that resonated loudly in the dead, quiet room. I looked up, bypassing the judge completely, and locked my cold eyes with the court clerk sitting directly below the bench. Her fingers were hovering nervously over the keys of her stenotype machine. Please ensure the official record reflects verbatim the judge's exact order compelling me to remove a federal military decoration, I stated. My voice was deadpan, completely devoid of any anger or emotion, yet it carried clearly and powerfully to every single corner of the room. Judge Vance scoffed loudly, waving a dismissive, chubby hand in the air. He leaned back comfortably into his high-backed leather chair, his chest puffing out with pride beneath his flowing black robes. He completely mistook my calm compliance for total surrender. He was absolutely delighted, fully convinced he had just successfully put a rebellious, stubborn veteran back in her proper place. But as I sat down and looked across the room at him, my expression remained completely stone cold. Anyone paying attention to the dead, calculating look in my eyes would have realized the terrifying truth. I was not surrendering. I was simply clearing the blast radius. Judge Arthur Vance had just confidently stepped directly onto a live landmine, and he was far too arrogant to hear the mechanical click beneath his polished leather shoes. The countdown had already begun, and he had absolutely no idea what kind of hell was coming for him. How did a decorated federal agent end up standing in a freezing county courtroom facing down a corrupt judge and a treacherous family member? The origin of this entire ugly war started with salt, sweat, and rusted iron at a place called Falcons Point. It was a sprawling piece of prime coastal property, a rugged old shipyard and marina that our late father had built from absolute nothing with his bare hands. Before his heart finally gave out 3 years ago, he left the deed split right down the middle, exactly 50% for me and 50% for my older brother, Liam, to me. Falcons Point was a sacred memorial. It was the only tangible piece left of the gruff, hard-working man who taught me how to navigate by the stars and tie a bowline knot before I could even ride a bicycle. But to my sister-in-law, Vanessa, it was just a dormant bank account waiting to be smashed open and drained. While Liam and Vanessa played house in their overly sanitized, heavily mortgaged suburban mansion, I spent my days on the harsh, open water. I work for the Meridian Tactical Defense Bureau, a highly classified agency operating deep in the shadows to handle extreme high-risk maritime operations that the standard Coast Guard or Navy simply cannot touch. That Navy Cross sitting quietly in its velvet box was not a participation trophy. I earned it during a Category 5 hurricane, pulling 12 trapped sailors from a sinking commercial freighter when the ocean waves were cresting at over 40 feet high. I never bragged about it. I never posted photos of it online. It was my private burden, a heavy reminder of the 2 good men from my squad we lost to the freezing black depths that horrific night. Vanessa, on the other hand, lived exclusively for the spotlight of her digital audience. She was an absolute slave to her social media metrics, endlessly chasing a synthetic lifestyle she simply could not actually afford. She burned through cash on $5,000 designer handbags, luxury sports cars, and extravagant overseas vacations, silently racking up hundreds of thousands of dollars in hidden, high-interest debt. When a massive luxury resort development group, heavily targeting our exact stretch of the coastline, offered to buy out Falcons Point to bulldoze it and build a high-end casino and spa, Vanessa saw her ultimate golden ticket. She demanded we sell immediately. The corporate payout would have been in the tens of millions of dollars. It was more than enough cash to fund her plastic, superficial reality for another 2 decades. I flatly refused to sign the transfer papers. I looked her dead in the eyes and told her, "Our father's legacy is not for sale to a pack of corporate vultures." That was the exact moment Liam completely folded. My brother had always been a deeply passive, conflict-avoidant man, But under Vanessa's constant, suffocating psychological manipulation over the last 7 years, he had been reduced to nothing more than a hollow, obedient puppet. He was so terrified of his wife's screaming tantrums and threats of divorce that he willingly let her drive a steel wedge straight through our family. He actually stood by, staring at his expensive leather shoes in total silence, while Vanessa formally filed a lawsuit against me on his behalf. The official legal charge was gross mismanagement of shared assets causing severe financial damage. It was an absolute, laughable joke. I had kept the marina completely out of the red during an economic downturn, turning a steady 25% profit every single quarter through sheer hard work and strict budgeting. But Vanessa was not content with just a slow, grinding legal battle. She wanted to break my spirit entirely and deliberately tank the property's market value so I would become desperate enough to sell for pennies on the dollar. Her dirty trick started small and escalated with vicious speed. First, it was just whispered rumors planted around town that the marina water was contaminated with illegal toxic waste, a lie designed to scare off our loyal, long-term boat owners. Then, things got physical. 3 weeks ago, I arrived at the docks at 4 o'clock in the morning for my daily maintenance check to find the main mooring line slashed, my father's old office windows completely shattered with heavy bricks, and the primary security cameras conveniently spray-painted black. Vanessa fully expected me to call her screaming, to throw a wild, emotional fit, or to retaliate in a blind, messy rage. She fundamentally misunderstood who she was dealing with. You do not survive deep water extraction missions under heavy enemy fire by panicking. Instead of confronting her, I went completely dark. I spent the next 72 straight hours operating on pure caffeine and ingrained military discipline. I quietly pulled the encrypted backup data logs from a hidden, secondary thermal camera system I had secretly installed on the roof months prior. I ran facial recognition and tracked the license plates of the thugs who smashed the windows. I followed the digital footprints of the anonymous shell accounts spreading the toxic waste rumors online, tracing their internet protocol addresses with software provided by my bureau contacts. As I painstakingly pieced the puzzle together, a much darker, far more dangerous picture emerged. The men who vandalized my property were not just cheap, random local thugs. They were on the official payroll of a private security firm exclusively contracted by that exact same luxury resort development group pushing to buy the land. Vanessa was simply not smart enough to orchestrate a coordinated, multi-layered sabotage campaign of this magnitude all by herself. She was just a greedy, useful idiot being heavily manipulated by a much larger, incredibly powerful corporate entity operating in the shadows. They were quietly funding her expensive legal fees and pulling her strings from behind the curtain. The final piece of their trap snapped shut on a freezing, rain-slicked Tuesday morning when a weary process server handed me the official subpoena to appear in court. I stood alone on the wet wooden deck of Falcons Point, the wind howling off the Atlantic Ocean, holding the thick stack of legal documents demanding I surrender my half of my father's life work. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel even a fraction of an ounce of sorrow for the absolute destruction of my family ties. I simply looked down at the court papers, and a cold, razor-sharp smile slowly spread across my face. They actually thought they had successfully cornered a helpless, grieving civilian. They had absolutely no idea. They had just authorized and initiated a military-grade counteroffensive. I calmly walked back into my ruined office, locked the heavy iron door behind me, and began systematically preparing for total war. The heavy silence following the removal of my medal was quickly shattered by the rustling of expensive legal paper. The actual trial commenced, and it was nothing more than a carefully choreographed theater of lies. Vanessa's high-priced corporate attorney stood up, dramatically unbuttoning his tailored suit jacket, and began passing out thick, glossy binders to the clerk and the judge. He launched into a meticulously rehearsed speech, projecting fake environmental assessments and completely fabricated property appraisals onto the large courtroom monitor. According to his deeply flawed presentation, I had intentionally driven our shared asset straight into the ground. He aggressively claimed that under my aggressive and incompetent management, the property value had plummeted by a staggering 45% in just 6 months. He painted a gruesome, entirely fictional picture for the court, alleging I was hoarding hazardous materials, neglecting basic infrastructure, and single-handedly turning a prime piece of real estate into an absolute dangerous slum. My attorney, a sharp and loyal man named Marcus, immediately stood up to raise a standard objection regarding the validity of their unverified environmental reports. Before Marcus could even finish his sentence, Judge Vance aggressively slammed his gavel down. "Overruled, counselor," Vance barked, leaning over his high bench with a menacing sneer. "Sit down and stop wasting my time. I am well aware that your client might be used to barking orders in a uniform, but running a business in the civilized world requires actual intellect, not just brute force and a bad attitude. We play by adult rules here, not military playground rules." Marcus expertly feigned a look of intense panic and defeat. He nervously adjusted his tie, stuttered a weak apology, and slumped heavily back into his wooden chair beside me. To the untrained eye, my legal defense was crumbling into absolute dust. But this was exactly the strategy I had explicitly instructed Marcus to execute during our briefing 48 hours prior. I told him to act weak, to stumble over his words, and to let them steamroll him completely. You never interrupt your enemy when they are in the process of exposing their own vulnerabilities. You must let their arrogance inflate until it reaches the point of absolute blindness. While Marcus played the role of the defeated lawyer, I sat perfectly still, my eyes scanning the room like a hawk surveying a field of mice. I completely ignored the venomous words being spoken and focused entirely on the behavioral baselines of the people in the room. Judge Vance was sweating, just a tiny bit around his receding hairline, despite the chilly air conditioning. More importantly, every 10 to 15 minutes, his eyes would dart down to his lap. He was checking a phone hidden beneath his judicial desk. Immediately after checking the screen, his gaze would subtly flick upward, bypassing the plaintiff's table entirely, to make direct eye contact with a man sitting in the third row of the public gallery. That man did not belong in a dusty county courthouse. He was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal gray suit, sporting a luxury platinum watch, and exuding the predatory calmness of a high-level corporate fixer. He was the invisible handler sent by the luxury resort development group, sitting there to ensure their multi-million-dollar investment proceeded exactly as planned. The silent communication between the corrupt judge and the corporate suit was so painfully obvious to someone trained in counterintelligence that it was almost insulting. Sensing the absolute lack of resistance from our side, Vanessa decided it was her moment to shine. Her lawyer called her to the witness stand. She practically glided across the floor, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood. She placed her manicured hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and then immediately launched into the performance of a lifetime. "I just want what is best for our family," Vanessa cried out, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated fragility. She pulled a silk handkerchief from her pocket and delicately dabbed at the corners of her dry eyes. Chloe has always been so aggressive, so deeply unstable since she came back from her deployments. I have tried for years to reason with her, to help her see that selling the property is the only way to save Liam and me from absolute financial ruin. But she refuses to cooperate. She screams at me. She acts like a violent dictator. I live in constant fear of what she might do to us next. She looked pleadingly at the judge, playing the ultimate victim. Judge Vance nodded sympathetically, his face contorted into a mask of righteous pity for her fabricated suffering. The gallery murmured in hushed, sympathetic tones. They were all buying the tragic narrative hook, line, and sinker. The charade had reached its absolute peak. They had laid out all their fake cards and fully committed to their perjury. It was finally time to change the rules of the game. Moving with complete serenity, I reached down into my reinforced leather briefcase resting on the floor. I bypassed my standard legal notepads and pulled out a heavy, matte black, military-grade tactical tablet. It was a restricted device issued directly by the Meridian Tactical Defense Bureau. encased in shockproof rubber and protected by a top-tier encryption protocol. I brought it up and placed it gently on the oak table in front of me. I pressed my right thumb against the biometric scanner at the bottom of the screen. The device hummed to life instantly, the screen glowing with a sharp, cold blue light that illuminated my face. I rested my index finger exactly 1 millimeter above the flashing red icon labeled Activate. The trap was fully primed. All I had to do was push. Vanessa stepped down from the witness stand, her fabricated tears drying the exact second she turned her back to the jury box. She shot me a look of pure, unadulterated venom mixed with absolute triumph. She practically skipped back to her seat, absolutely convinced the show was over and she had already won the grand prize. My attorney, Marcus, stood up slowly, putting on his best performance of a defeated man, and quietly announced that the defense called Chloe Ryan to the stand. I picked up my heavily armored tactical tablet from the defense table. I walked toward the witness box with measured, perfectly silent, and highly predatory steps. I did not swear my oath on the Bible with a trembling hand. I affirmed my statement with a cold, unwavering stare directed right at the man sitting on the high bench. Judge Vance leaned forward, his face flushed with deep irritation. "Make this extremely quick, young lady," he sneered, tapping an expensive gold pen against his heavy wooden block. "My patience for your military stubbornness ran out exactly 2 hours ago. I have already heard more than enough to make my final ruling today." "I seriously doubt that, Your Honor," I replied. My voice sliced through the stuffy, warm air of the courtroom like a freshly sharpened razor blade. "I formally request permission to connect my device to the courtroom projection system to present Defense Exhibit A." Vance rolled his eyes, waving a chubby hand in the air lazily. "Fine. Show us your little financial spreadsheets. Miss Ryan, it will not change the cold hard fact that you have maliciously destroyed a multi-million-dollar commercial property." I plugged the universal display cable into the base of my tablet. I did not pull up a financial spreadsheet. I pressed my finger directly onto the flashing red icon I had prepared earlier. Instantly, the massive television screen mounted on the wall switched from Vanessa's fake property value graphs to a stark, blindingly white background. In the dead center of the screen was the heavily guarded, highly classified seal of the Department of Defense, flanked on the right by the intimidating black and silver emblem of the Meridian Tactical Defense Bureau. Beneath those seals was a highly restricted, heavily redacted federal operational directive. The entire courtroom froze solid. The arrogant, mocking smirks on the faces of Vanessa and her expensive corporate lawyer vanished in a fraction of a second, immediately replaced by a sudden, creeping sense of dread. "What kind of ridiculous joke is this?" Judge Vance demanded, his voice dropping an octave as his eyes darted frantically over the towering federal insignias. "Turn that monitor off immediately. You absolutely do not have the legal clearance to display federal military propaganda in my county courtroom." "It is not propaganda, Arthur," I said, deliberately and disrespectfully dropping his formal judicial title. The sheer audacity of my tone made his jaw drop in shock. "It is the strict federal law, specifically Federal Security Act Section 402. I stepped out from behind the protective wooden barrier of the witness stand, taking total physical command of the room. I am not a retired, washed-up veteran holding on to past glory. I am an active senior operative with the Meridian Tactical Defense Bureau, and I am currently on active deployment status. At exactly 8 o'clock this morning, when I walked through the security doors of this building, I was officially in transit to a highly classified intelligence briefing at our regional headquarters. My dress uniform and my Navy Cross were explicitly mandated by federal operational protocol. I raised my hand and pointed directly at his sweaty, pale face. Under Section 402, compelling a federal officer on active duty to strip their uniform or surrender their commendations of valor is a Class A federal felony. It constitutes direct, intentional, and malicious interference with federal maritime security operations. Judge Vance turned a violent shade of purple. The thick veins in his neck bulged dangerously, as he grabbed his heavy wooden gavel and began smashing it down with frantic, deafening strikes that echoed off the high ceiling. "Contempt of court," Vance roared, actual spit flying from his trembling lips. "I am the supreme judicial authority in this county. I do not care one single bit about your imaginary secret agent status. Bailiff, arrest this woman right now. I am throwing you in a maximum security holding cell for 90 days without any possibility of bail." The two armed county bailiffs stationed at the heavy oak doors took a hesitant step forward, their hands resting nervously on their weapons, but they immediately froze in their tracks when I raised my left hand. I did not even look at them. My eyes were locked completely and exclusively on the corrupt judge. "You can certainly try to have me arrested, Arthur," I said, my voice dropping to a low, incredibly dangerous whisper that somehow carried perfectly to every single terrified ear in the room. "But before you put me in heavy iron handcuffs, you are going to have to explain your highly illegal actions to the gentleman sitting quietly in the back row." I shifted my stance and pointed a single, steady finger toward the very back right corner of the public viewing gallery. All morning, a man in a plain, slate-gray suit had been sitting in that exact spot in absolute silence, completely blending into the dull background. Everyone in the room, including Vanessa and Judge Vance, had simply assumed he was just another bored local citizen killing time on a Tuesday. But as my finger pointed directly at him, the man stood up with terrifying military precision. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored jacket and flipped open a black leather wallet, revealing a heavy, gleaming gold federal shield. "Special Inspector Hayes, Federal Judicial Oversight Commission," the man announced. His voice was cold, authoritative, and carried the absolute crushing weight of the United States federal government. "I am here at the formal, written invitation of Operative Ryan to officially observe and report on these proceedings." Total chaos instantly erupted at the plaintiff's table. Vanessa jumped out of her expensive leather chair, her perfectly contoured face twisted in sheer, unadulterated panic. She violently grabbed her lawyer by the shoulder of his custom suit, shaking him like a rag doll. "What is happening?" Vanessa hissed frantically, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched squeal. "Fix this right now! This was not in the script. You explicitly promised me she was just a stupid, broke boat mechanic." Her high-priced lawyer was completely paralyzed. His mouth was opening and closing like a suffocating fish pulled straight from the ocean as he stared with wide, terrified eyes at the federal badge shining in the back of the room. He knew instantly that his lucrative legal career was entirely over, but the absolute most beautiful reaction came from Judge Arthur Vance himself. He slowly lowered his wooden gavel, his hand shaking so violently he almost dropped it, all the blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a bloated, rotting corpse. He stared down in pure horror at the court clerk sitting below his bench, who was still sitting frozen with her fingers hovering directly over her stenotype machine. The horrifying realization hit Vance like a speeding 100-ton freight train. He remembered the exact, calculating command I had given the clerk just 2 hours ago. I had forced her to record his arrogant order to remove my medal verbatim. The brilliant, untouchable, all-powerful county judge had not just committed a massive federal felony in front of a federal inspector. He had explicitly ordered the state clerk to record his own crime on the official, unalterable audio and written record of the court. He had literally locked the steel handcuffs around his own wrists, and I was the one holding the only key. I watched the color completely drain from Judge Vance's face, but I was not even close to being finished. Stripping him of his judicial arrogance in front of a federal agent was just the appetizer. I was there to utterly dismantle the entire corrupt machine they had built to steal my father's legacy, and I intended to burn it down to the absolute foundation. "Since we now have the full attention of a federal inspector," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the heavy, panicked breathing of the opposing counsel, "I would like to formally submit Defense Exhibit B. This is a direct counterclaim regarding the legal standing and the core financial motivation behind this entire forced sale." Before Judge Vance could even open his mouth to formulate an objection, I tapped the screen of my tablet. The massive monitor mounted on the courtroom wall shifted instantly from the imposing federal seals to a highly detailed, incredibly complex forensic accounting flowchart. It was a digital map of dirty money, painstakingly traced by the best cyber-intelligence financial analysts the Meridian Tactical Defense Bureau had to offer. What you are looking at is a verified transactional web, I explained, stepping aside so the entire public gallery could clearly see the damning evidence. Starting precisely 7 months ago, the luxury resort development group pushing to acquire Falcons Point authorized a massive offshore wire transfer. The exact amount was $500,000, labeled very vaguely in their corporate ledgers as independent environmental consulting fees. I pointed to the bright red line on the screen connecting the corporate logo of the resort developers to a newly established limited liability corporation registered in a notorious overseas tax haven. This shell company has no physical address, absolutely no recorded employees, and absolutely no history of real estate or environmental consulting, but it does have a single, sole managing director. I tapped the biometric screen of my tablet one more time. A high-resolution photograph of a legally binding incorporation document flashed onto the monitor. The signature at the absolute bottom of the page was bold, unmistakable, and legally notarized. It read, Vanessa Ryan, a collective. Echoing gasp ripped through the crowded courtroom. I turned my head slowly and locked cold eyes with my sister-in-law. Her fragile, perfectly constructed facade shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of the entire town. The caring, devoted family woman she had pretended to be on the witness stand just 20 minutes ago was violently ripped away, exposing the greedy, backstabbing traitor underneath. She had not filed this vicious lawsuit because I was a bad manager, or because she genuinely wanted to save her family from financial ruin. She had taken a massive, illegal corporate bribe to sell out my father's blood, sweat, and legacy from the inside. You took a $500,000 bribe to destroy our family? A voice suddenly roared from the front row of the gallery. It was Liam. My passive, broken, thoroughly manipulated older brother had finally snapped out of his 7-year psychological coma. He vaulted over the low wooden partition separating the public gallery from the trial floor, his face red with an explosive mixture of absolute heartbreak and unadulterated rage. Liam, please, it is not what it looks like, Vanessa shrieked in terror. Backing away from him so fast, she crashed heavily into the plaintiff's table, knocking over expensive water pitchers and legal binders. I did it for us. I did it to secure our future. You sold out our father's grave for designer shoes and a fake internet life, Liam screamed, his voice breaking as hot tears of utter betrayal streamed down his face. He pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at her chest. I let you turn me against my own flesh and blood. I let you drag our family name through the mud for absolute lies. The courtroom rapidly devolved into absolute, unmanageable chaos. Spectators were shouting and pointing. The highly paid corporate fixer sitting in the third row was frantically typing on his encrypted phone, desperately trying to do immediate damage control for his billionaire bosses before sprinting for the exit door. Vanessa was sobbing hysterically, desperately clinging to the sleeve of her lawyer, who was furiously trying to pull his arm away from her to save his own ruined skin. But I was not done. I had one final, armor-piercing bullet left in the chamber, and I had saved it specifically for the man sweating profusely in the black robe. Quiet, I commanded, my voice, heavily honed by years of projecting orders over the deafening roar of ocean storms and heavy automatic gunfire, instantly silenced the raging room. I turned my focus entirely back to Judge Vance, who was currently gripping the edges of his elevated wooden desk so hard his knuckles were entirely white. The corruption does not stop at my treacherous sister-in-law, I stated coldly, staring right through his panicked eyes. I reached down and pressed the final activation key on my tablet. The financial flowchart on the giant screen updated instantly. A new, thick red line shot out from Vanessa's hidden shell company account. It traced a series of highly sophisticated digital money laundering steps, bouncing rapidly through 3 different offshore banks to hide the trail. before finally landing directly into a supposedly anonymous local political action committee. "As you can clearly see on the screen," I announced, raising my voice to make absolutely sure Special Inspector Hayes in the back row heard every single syllable. 75% of that corporate bribe, exactly $375,000, was subsequently funneled straight out of Vanessa's control. It was quietly redirected into the primary re-election campaign fund of the presiding official of this very court. A massive, undeniable photograph of Judge Arthur Vance appeared on the screen right next to the exact routing numbers of his highly illegal, secret campaign account. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the terrifying, vacuum-like silence of a massive bomb detonating, sucking all the oxygen out of the air right before the lethal shockwave hits. Judge Vance completely lost his mind. Total, uncontrolled panic overrode every single rational thought in his brain. He grabbed his heavy wooden gavel and began smashing it against the sounding block with a frantic, animalistic ferocity. "Turn it off!" Vance screamed, his voice cracking violently, completely shedding any remaining illusion of judicial dignity. "Turn that monitor off right now. This entire proceeding is permanently sealed. Every single piece of evidence you have presented today is entirely inadmissible, highly illegal, and completely fabricated. I am terminating this trial immediately. I am the judge. I make the rules. I command you to shut that screen down and surrender that device." He was standing up behind his bench, waving his arms wildly, desperately trying to use the very last shreds of his rapidly disintegrating local authority to cover up the undeniable proof of his own massive corruption. He looked like a pathetic, drowning man furiously trying to command the rising ocean tide to stop. But the tide had already crested, and the violent waves were crashing down directly on his head. Judge Vance was backed completely into a corner, and like a rabid animal, he lashed out with blind desperation. He pointed a trembling, sweat-slicked finger directly at me. "Arrest her right this instant!" Vance shrieked at the stunned county bailiffs. "Confiscate that tablet and destroy it. She is committing illegal cyber espionage. She hacked into private financial institutions. Take her into custody." He actually thought he could use brute physical force to smash the evidence and bury the truth right there on the courtroom floor. But his absolute, suffocating arrogance had completely blinded him to the massive trap I had set hours ago. Before the county bailiffs could even reach for their heavy-duty belts, a thunderous crash violently shook the room. The massive oak doors at the back of the courtroom burst completely open, slamming incredibly hard against the walls. A highly coordinated tactical squad of Federal Bureau of Investigation agents and armed United States Marshals poured into the room, their heavy boots stomping in perfect, terrifying unison down the center aisle. The lead federal agent bypassed the gallery entirely and marched straight up to the judicial bench. He held up a thick stack of federal warrants. The brilliant, absolute perfection of the trap finally snapped shut. When Judge Vance had proudly and publicly ordered me to remove my Navy Cross that morning, he had officially committed the federal felony of obstructing a government officer on active duty. That single, arrogant command gave the federal government the absolute, unquestionable legal jurisdiction to immediately intervene, bypass all local county authority, and permanently seize every single physical document and digital server inside the courthouse. Vance had literally handed them the keys to his own destruction. "Arthur Vance, you are under federal arrest," the lead agent announced, his voice booming with undeniable authority. Two heavily armed agents flanked the high wooden bench. They hauled the corrupt judge up by his arms, violently twisting them behind his back. The sharp, heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed loudly through the dead, silent room. An agent reached out and forcefully stripped the flowing black judicial robe right off Vance's shoulders, leaving the once powerful man standing there in a soaked, wrinkled dress shirt, completely stripped of his fake authority and utterly humiliated in front of the entire town he had terrorized for years. Down on the courtroom floor, Vanessa's perfectly curated world completely disintegrated. She collapsed onto the hardwood floor, her expensive designer suit ruined, sobbing hysterically as her makeup ran down her face in dark streaks. Two United States Marshals hauled her up by her arms, coldly reading her Miranda rights for massive financial fraud and federal conspiracy to commit extortion. She cried out for Liam, desperately begging him to save her. My brother stood perfectly still for a moment. Then, with a look of absolute, cold disgust, he turned his back on the toxic woman who had manipulated him for nearly a decade. He did not say a single word. He just walked straight out the heavy double doors, permanently severing his ties with her forever. Exactly 1 month later, the sky was a brilliant, crystal-clear blue. I stood alone on the sturdy wooden docks of Falcons Point, listening to the rhythmic, soothing sound of the Atlantic Ocean waves crashing against the wooden pylons. The corrupt corporate developers had completely abandoned their project and fled the state the exact second the federal indictments dropped. My father's shipyard, his blood and sweat, was permanently secured. I reached into the pocket of my dark jacket and pulled out the small, velvet-lined wooden box. I opened it and gently lifted the heavy bronze Navy cross. With a quiet, steady breath, I pinned it right back over my heart, exactly where it belonged. There were no cheering crowds to witness it. There were no flashing cameras. I did not need them. I knew exactly what my honor was worth. And no corrupt authority figure would ever take it away from me again. Evil people often think power can bend absolutely anything to their will. But they completely forget that people like Chloe do not need to roar to prove their incredible strength. When they are perfectly silent, that is the exact moment the final verdict has truly been decided. Thank you all so incredibly much for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from right now? Please let me know down in the comments below. As I mentioned at the beginning, since YouTube has completely demonetized our channel and we no longer have the budget to operate, we will absolutely not be uploading any new videos here in the near future. We are shifting all of our energy over to Patreon. If you found today's story powerful, please help support us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon community. Over there, you can listen to the absolute best, longest, and most exclusive true stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can join right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link located in the description box or the pinned comment of this video. Thank you again for your amazing support. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you over on Patreon.